Hi, I'm Ingo from Roast Travels, and today I have a very special guest. He's one of the people within the coffee roasting community whose opinion I value the most. He's a really experienced roaster. He's a roasting educator, and he's somebody that's not taking things for granted, but really uses research to gather some new knowledge. And he's somebody that's really active in helping the coffee roasting community by sharing all this knowledge in various publication, lectures, presentations, and the person I'm talking about is none else than Rob House. Welcome, Rob. Nice to have you.
It's nice to be here, and thank you for such an overly kind introduction.
Well, thank you for coming. Today I have some questions. On one hand, it's questions that are kind of driving me or that I know from other roasters that are very often coming. And then also have some questions that came from people within the coffee roasting community that asked me to ask you here. So I would say let's start now. But maybe before we directly run into the question, to those few people that probably don't know you yet, can you give a short introduction on who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Rob. I live in Rainier, Oregon, which is about an hour north of Portland in the United States. And I've been roasting coffee since probably 2009, maybe a little before then, and got my start as not only roasting as part of the business that I was working in, but also as a home roaster. Those two things kind of started concurrently because I wasn't able to play when I was at work. And so I bought B-More, was one of my first roasters I was able to do much with. I started actually with the iRoast 2, but then moved on to B-More and used that as my primary sample roaster until probably 2014 when I sent it to Nicaragua with one of our farmers and started using something else here. So, I've got a big heart for people who home roast. Absolutely, the home roast community that exists and are so supportive and encouraging, and are just out there kind of exploring coffee. But yeah, I've worked as a professional roaster. I've been consulting since 2013. Wrote a book on changing flavor in coffee, and that's kind of it. So
you know the whole world of roasting, from home roasting to commercial roasting and education.
Mm-hmm. Although I never built my own rig. I know there's some home roasters out there who have their own setup that they've built. I never went that far, but
oh yeah, absolutely. There are quite some, and a lot of my the people that are watching this are also home roasters. Some are starting into roasting, like into commercial roasting. And so one question that is kind of driving me, and that I also hear a lot from other people, is there is just a lot of information around on roasting, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish which of this information or decisions are doing a big change when it comes to the taste of a coffee, and which are then really details. And I think a lot of people are kind of a bit losing themselves in details. That's why my first question to you is kind of from big to small, what are, in your opinion, the most important decisions when I want to roast a nice coffee?
Yeah, so I'll start in terms of talking about roasting decisions. I'll actually just kind of point directly to a friend of mine, Morten Munchau, over there in Copenhagen. And some of the research that he's published follows in suit with what I follow as well, which is that the biggest driver of flavor is going to be color, both your whole bean and ground color. And you may not have a way of measuring that, but it still is the primary driver of the flavor of the coffee that you're doing. So the biggest change you can make is to change the final output color of the coffee, both in terms of its whole bean and its ground color. Those are influenced by a few different things. So your whole bean color is going to be just about temperature exposure primarily. Your internal color, or your ground color, which isn't really your internal, it represents the average color of the coffee, because as you grind it and pulverize it, it kind of averages everything out from inside to outside. So your average color is impacted not only by the overall temperature you've driven it to, but also how long after first crack it's been given. So usually a short time after first crack and your interior color is going to be lighter, which causes your average color to be lighter. A longer time after first crack, and it becomes a lot more consistent throughout. And so your ground average color gets closer to the whole bean color. Never perfectly so, but that's a good thing. So that's kind of one of the main drivers of flavor is the color of the coffee. Secondarily, development time plays a huge part in the flavor of the coffee. And so because it seems to do so much with acidity and fruity profiles, that, if you don't want acidity and it's there, or you want acidity and it's not there, these can both be big problems. So making sure that you have the appropriate development time and then are hitting that development time the same way every time. So, when I'm talking about time windows, usually we're thinking plus or minus about 10 seconds to be, close enough to be okay. Color, depending on what measurement system you're using, plus or minus 3 points agtron is usually fine. If you're using something like Roast Vision, then you want to have it the same number. So they all have different sensitivity levels, and based on their sensitivity level, you kind of have to choose what you want consistency wise. And then following that is, when do you hit first crack? This can be a huge flavor change as well. Hitting first crack later tends to push you more savory, less floral, and it tends to increase, and this is something I got in trouble with in the book, so I'll give some clarification here. Complete doesn't necessarily mean good, it just means complex. And so usually as you push first crack back, you do tend to get more complexity, in my opinion, in the cup. And this can represent as various sugar browning flavors like caramels, nuts, toffee, chocolate, all these sorts of flavors coming through. But that's not necessarily good, it just is. For me also, that does tend to increase the body. So if you increase your time to first crack, so say your first crack is at 10 minutes instead of 9 or instead of 8, then you're getting more complexity, a little bit more body / heaviness. But the trade-off is you're losing on florals and you're losing out on clarity, because clarity is the other side of the spectrum. When you don't have complexity, you have a few notes that shine through really, really well. And so usually if I'm going for like a lighter roast coffee or something that I want to be floral or just like floral, fruity, sweet, that's it, I'll usually push first crack faster to get more florals, more clarity out of the cup. But once again, kind of cascading, color is the most important bit. Then you're talking about development time, then when did you hit first crack? And then all the piddly details are probably like 5% of the actual overall flavor of coffee, 5 to 10%. So it's not super significant. So what you're doing with your max ROR, or what you're doing with your time to yellowing and all of these sorts of things kind of fall in that mid-range, where you really want to be super happy with where you're at with everything else before you start kind of picking at those little details. In terms of coffee flavor then, the hard thing is, with cultivar and processing methods now globally being shared, it's hard to just say like, oh, well, this is definitely from this origin because it has XYZ flavor profile. And so when it comes to what's the biggest impact of your overall roast in terms of flavor, picking the coffee is really important. There's a saying in the United States, I don't know if you've heard it over there, you can't polish a turd. I don't know, is this a...
No, I don't know this expression, but I can imagine. So you mean like if the coffee is bad, you cannot make something good out of it.
Right. And the window of acceptability gets lower. So if you're buying, let's say, an 80-point coffee, yeah, it's harder to roast that coffee to get to those 80 points well than it is if you buy like an 87-point coffee, 90-point coffee, you could roast it terribly and it'll probably still taste really nice. Yeah. So the most important thing is the quality of the coffee that you're buying. You can only do so much with roasting. It's not magic. You can't magically make a coffee have a flavor that it doesn't have to begin with. You can't magically increase the quality of the coffee. Those things just don't work out. So if you're buying good quality product, you will get a good quality result. It's like cooking, right? Professional cooking. The better the ingredients, the better the end product. Unfortunately, unlike in cooking, you can't just add a ton of butter and salt to make it even better.
I would add some sugar like in the torrefacio roast.
Yeah, I have no experience with that, but maybe I wouldn't put any of that in your sample roasters though, or your home roasters. But yeah, I mean, so buying good quality coffee, number one, finding origins that you like. Generally, a higher altitude coffee tends to be more acidic. Lower altitude coffee tends to be less acidic. That's not always the case, but that's often the case. So if you're looking for acidity, you need to be buying higher altitude coffees. If you're looking for low acidity, you're going to be looking at lower altitude coffees, generally speaking. Processing method overrides a lot. So if it's a natural processed coffee, that's going to override a lot about cultivar and terroir, even in terms of where it was grown, how it was grown. The processing method can be really dominant. So naturals tend to be really fruit forward, earthy, chocolatey. They can come across as really sweet sometimes. They can also get fermenty and funky, so you got to be careful. Honey processed coffees tend to be that nice middle ground where they can go either direction. They can be really crazy fermenty funky, or they can be really balanced, clean, sweet. And then wash processed coffees tend to be more like citric and malic in nature, so more like citrus fruits and apples. They tend to be a little bit more floral and have a little bit of the lower body, but these are all very giant generalizations.
Is there kind of different approaches that you use for roasting, for example, naturals or washed coffees? Could you kind of give a rule of thumb to have a general approach on processing and roasting?
Yeah, I'll pull from, I like the way that Joe Morocco told me this one time. The way he phrased it just kind of encapsulated how we often approach coffee roasting for naturals. Pretend that they're already somewhat roasted. And so generally, this means shorter development time and lower end temperature. So if I was roasting a natural processed coffee, really light, like kind of the light style of our day and time, how a lot of the fancier coffee roasteries are doing it, I would probably aim for 1:15 to 1:30 development time, whereas with a washed coffee, I'm probably aiming more toward 1:30 to 2 minutes development time for the same coffee, just if it was processed differently. So usually natural processed coffees can get away with shorter development times without being super vegetable-y, whereas with the same coffee as a washed, it wouldn't come out so favorably.
So when you say
sometimes washed coffees need a full 2 minutes.
Okay,
sorry,
interesting. But when you're talking about the development time, are you then also talking about different end colors, because we've been talking about the color, or are you kind of reaching the same color but in a shorter development time with naturals, for example?
And that's where it depends. So generally speaking, I get a little bit worried if my Agtron is higher than 110 ground, and that's ground for espresso. So that number is relatively meaningless to most people out there, probably. So I'll give a more common reading. So like usually if my weight loss is less than 11%, I'm a little concerned that I've gone too light, regardless of the coffee. Now, there's some coffees where I can go below 11% and it works out fine. That has something to do with the initial moisture content, which you may or may not be able to know. Hopefully your traders are telling you, right? So if you have a 9% moisture content coffee, you could have 10.5% weight loss and be okay. If you have a 10% moisture content coffee and you've only got 10.5% weight loss, then it's probably under, just guessing. So 11 and above, I'm pretty comfortable with. 11 and below, I'm a little bit worried about. With naturals, I do tend to roast them lighter with exceptions. So there are some coffees where I have to push it a little bit darker than I do its washed counterpart to get it within an acceptable range.
So if you're talking about 10, 11% weight loss, then you're talking about quite light roast. So for example, in Europe, we have quite a range of different roast styles. We have a bit more northern, we have this light roast, but from Switzerland and more south, we have then this Italian roast. So people really like darker roast. And I think you cannot make an espresso roast with 10, 11% development time, or do you think you could?
It's very, basically you're putting the entire burden on the barista.
Yeah.
And so because can it be done? Yes. Is it easy? No, absolutely not. Is it easy to get a really well-balanced shot with that low of a weight loss? So, for espresso roasting, typically we're stretching the roast. We're going longer because we want more, I don't know if it's more Maillard reaction byproducts or just different Maillard reaction byproducts, but I want to give it more complexity and more heaviness so that it stands up to milk, because most people drink milk drinks, just by and large. I'm usually giving it longer development time because I want to neutralize some of that acidity, because the espresso tends to extract a lot of acidity anyway. And I'm usually roasting darker That's both going to help with solubility, and it's also going to help bring balance, since my espresso shots are going to tend toward under extraction. Just by and large, I feel like most people tend to under extract espresso just by the nature of it. So you just kind of make your roast a little bit more forgiving that way by going longer development time and a little higher end temperature. So maybe on the light end, we're talking 13-14%.
Yeah.
And on the darker end, sky's the limit depending on your preference.
Sure. So I want to pick up some things that you said before, and we've been talking about color as the most important factor for the taste when it then comes to roasting. And one thing, because that was also a question from another person, Gregory, that you already answered to us, he's having the problem that the beans are outside in the color that he wants to reach, but inside too light. So you say with the development time, you can actually then kind of even the color from the inside to the outside of the bean.
Absolutely, yeah. So just stretching that development time out really helps with that a lot.
Okay, perfect. And then another question when it comes to the color, because most of the people that are watching this, they don't have Actron meters, or they even don't have this kind of, laser meters to even measure the color during the roast. So what can you give here as advice? Is it like linear? Is like the color very similarly to the like BT temperature or IBTS temperature in the ideal bullet, or is it not that easy? It's not
I
that
wish
simple.
it was that easy, because even on professional roasting machines, depending on your heat application at the end of the roast, you can see skews of 7 degrees centigrade to get to the same color. So like, let's say I'm roasting along and I feel like I'm a little bit behind, so I leave my burner higher instead of lowering it. That increases my air temperature, and the air filtering through the bean mass increases the bean temperature reading. But because the bean temperature probe is made of metal, it's actually accelerating faster than the bean mass is, because the bean mass is an organic material. It doesn't absorb heat the same way. And so you can actually get the bean temperature probe to go up to the final end temperature properly and still have the beans be under roasted. And so, yeah, so there's been times where I've roasted the same coffee the same way, except for at the very tail end. And on purpose, I've been able to get 7 degrees centigrade separation while still hitting the exact same color. So the coffee is the same coming out. My bean temperature probe just read it differently. So making sure that you're being consistent with your heat application is really important. And then you can have an increased reliability in terms of what your thermocouple means at that temperature. The best thing you can do is take weight loss readings, because your weight loss will tell you a lot about where you're at roast wise, and it's free because you've already got a gram scale to weigh the greens out. All you got to do is weigh the roasted out also. So if your weight loss is outside of 0.5 percentage point difference compared to the previous roast that you did of that coffee, then you're talking about some significant flavor differences. Usually I want mine to be within 0.25% if I can, to make sure that I'm being consistent. And then, generally speaking, 11 to 13% is light roast, 13 to 16% is kind of medium roast, and then 16% to 18% is dark roast, and then 18 to 22 is extra dark, sort of thing.
Yeah, very dark then. And when we've been talking about development time as an influence factor on the taste of the roast, you said that is kind of the second most important influence when it comes to roasting. Are you then talking about really the time, or are you talking about the ratio? Because it's very common to use this development time ratio.
For me, I personally prefer time. I can understand how the ratio interplays, but I think it's a lot less direct. Because even if I roast really fast, I still need a certain amount of time post first crack to get proper development. And so the ratio works well when you're talking about normal ranges. So if you're hitting first crack at 9 minutes, yeah, that's fine. If you're hitting first crack at 5 minutes, well, now things are a little bit out of spec in terms of what the percentages need to be. And same thing if you're going extra long. So, what happens when you're roasting coffee is there's actually, you can see if you cut a bean in half right before first crack, there's actually a clear demarcation line in the seed. So only the outer surface is really going through color change at any normal rate. So when we're looking at the color change of the coffee inside the roaster, we're really seeing the surface color change. at first crack, the water escapes the coffee, and then the color change can move on inward. It's delayed because of that water storage. So really, you've got to give it a certain amount of time after that water has evacuated in order to get it to develop properly or cook properly inside. Now, the air temperatures during that development time do play a role in that, but it's really hard to kind of give that clear guidance across multiple different roasting machines. So if your air temperature is higher, you could theoretically get away with a shorter development time because you're cooking the insides faster, but then it just gets really wiggly and overcomplicated. So what I would just say is I usually look at time, because it's really just like, how long am I giving it now that the center can cook? It's like a new roast started when development time started, and I've got to give it a certain amount of time to be done.
Okay. Then we've been also talking about the beans, because the beans have quite an influence, or as you said, has probably is one of the factors with the highest influence on the taste also. And are there any special factors that people have to look at when it comes to beans, like origin, processing, density, moisture activity? And is there kind of, because I mean, not everybody watching here has the money to buy great lab equipment. So is there kind of equipment or measurement tools that you would recommend to anybody?
Yeah, so I mean, quick measurement tools, density is the easiest one. You can buy really inexpensive graduated cylinders and a scale that can read to the hundredths point of grams. And water displacement is the best way to do density reading. So I'll take my graduated cylinder that goes up to 50 ml. I'll fill it with water to 40 ml. I'll add beans till I get to 50 ml. And then I know how many grams it takes for 10 ml. I can multiply the grams that I get at the end by 100, and that tells me the density. And I've spent maybe $10 on graduated cylinders, right? And maybe another $10 on the scale. I don't know. But it's very inexpensive. And density helps you understand not how fast you should roast, but kind of how fast you can roast. Like it helps you understand if there's a speed limit on the road. If it's a low density coffee, you're at an increased risk of creating roasting defects if you go too fast. If it's a high density coffee, you can go as fast or slow as you want, and it'll probably be okay. And so if you end up with something that's like, 1160, 1200 grams per liter, that's a pretty high density coffee. And I doubt that you'll push it so fast that you'll cause tipping. Whereas if you end up with like 1120, somewhere in there, it's probably pretty soft, and you may want to be gentle with it.
And then you're talking about the preheat temperature or the temperature, like the burner settings during the first part of the roast?
Yes, both and. Because it's all interdependent. So your preheat setting, you could do a higher preheat setting in a soak and have a slower roast, or you could do a lower preheat setting and hit it with burner straight away or power straight away, and you could get to the same roast length that way. And so it's really just dependent on how you choose to drive your roasting machine, because both are totally acceptable. They're just different ways of doing things. I like to do soaking when I need to slow down, but I don't want to take the time to cool my roaster off, because if I've got a really good between batch rhythm going and I'm like, just bring it in hot, leave the burner down for a little bit, and then bring the burner up later on. But I could have also just taken the time and cooled the roaster down and then, push it from the beginning. So that's one thing. Moisture meter wise, is a home roaster, it's a hard pill to swallow because the cheapest ones are like $300 US. They work well, the $300 ones, but that's still a lot for something that could just be a hobby at the time. If you're getting into it professionally, you should get one, especially if you're storing coffee for any length of time, because you want to keep an eye on the coffee as it's aging. But you should also be able to trust your importer, exporter, whomever you're buying coffee from, to be able to tell you that information. And if they can't tell you that information, then it's possible that they don't know, which is really scary to buy coffee from someone who doesn't know the moisture content of the coffee that they're buying. So that would be the direction I would say to go.
And then is there a different way of roasting the beans according to their moisture content, or is it more than just about to store them and keep them longer fresh?
Yeah, so usually if the moisture is like above 11.5, you want to prioritize using that coffee first and get it over with, because it'll probably age faster than the rest of your coffee. You know, if you've got a lower moisture content coffee and it's like high density, like let's say you've got like a low moisture content Ethiopian coffee, that coffee will probably be good a calendar year from its arrival. And you know, whereas if you've got like a high moisture content Peru, you're probably going to use that in 6 months or less from its time of arrival. When it comes to roasting, water represents a barrier to heat uptake. And so if you have an 11% moisture content coffee, you're going to have to add more energy to that roast to get it to follow the same curve than you would a coffee that was at 10 or 9.5% moisture content, because a lot of what we're doing is heating the water, and water goes through this really called the latent heat of vaporization, where it takes more energy to get water to go from liquid at 100 C to gas at 100 C than it takes to heat it from zero. And this is why when we boil a pot of water on the stove to make pasta, the water just doesn't all evaporate when it gets to 100 C. It takes a very long time to evaporate all the water from the pot, because it has to make that phase change. And so with coffee, the more water that you have, the more energy you have to push into the coffee to get it to go through phase change to get you to first crack. So it's kind of one of those things where if I have a wet coffee or a wetter coffee, it's still within spec, still under 12%. But if it's like 11, I know I'm going to have to put a little bit more energy in it. So I'm going to plan to roast it differently.
In your book, you have been breaking down the time to first crack into these two segments with the yellowing phase. So you made like the drying period and the maillard period. Is this then relevant? So would you say with a coffee that has more moisture, you apply more heat in the yellowing phase, and then you can roast it from then in the maillard phase about the same? Or would you just make it a bit easier and say, just in the first part of the roast until first crack, apply more heat?
Yeah, so the breakdown between the two, I've started de-emphasizing that in my own teaching, because Morton was very helpful in showing me that in the testing, people couldn't pick up on it. Time to first crack seemed more relevant to the tasters than bringing it down into these sections. And I know from experience, when I was doing the experimentation for the book initially, it's really hard to keep everything the same, but modify the drying phase alone or modify the maillard alone. So it was a lot easier to be like, okay, it's more practical to say, move the timing to first crack than it is to say, move this here and do this. Because then sometimes you have a roast where you're like hurrying up to get to yellowing and then slowing way down to try and get to first crack. And it just creates really difficult control issues. So since it didn't seem to be that impressive of a difference, I decided that I was going to start de-emphasizing that. I don't know how big of a role it plays, but based on the research I've seen, it seems to not play as big of a role. So I felt kind of comfortable not worrying about it as much. Now, that being said, the coffee is drying all the way until first crack. And so even though we call it the drying phase, the drying doesn't finish at the end of the drying phase. That's just us drying the surface out so that color change can start happening. The inside is still quite wet until first crack. So,
okay, interesting. We've been talking about tipping and roasting defects before, and can you a bit go more into roasting defects? Is it really then, I mean, when we talk about roasting defects, is it really defects, or is it kind of taste characteristics, or would you say, no, there are really some things that we have to label as a defect? And then also, what are kind of the most relevant ones, and how can I avoid those as a roaster?
Yeah, absolutely. So I usually break them down into two categories. There's objective roasting defects, which are like, these are real and you can see them. And then there's subjective roasting defects, which you hinted at. The subjective roasting defects are underdeveloped or overdeveloped. As is beauty, overdeveloped and underdeveloped are in the eye of the beholder, right? So for me, your underdeveloped coffee might be perfectly developed. Or vice versa, or my perfectly developed coffee might taste overdeveloped to you, depending on your preferences. Same thing with over roasted and under roasted. So overdeveloped and underdeveloped, specifically talking about the stretch from first crack till the end of the roast. Over roasted and under roasted, specifically talking about the end degree of roast, or roast color, roast temperature, that sort of thing. And then there's the baked defect. There are so many different definitions of baked out there, and it's used so many different ways. The only thing I can tell you in terms of like, here's how I understand what the baked defect is. It means the other person didn't like your coffee. So if someone says your coffee tastes baked, the only thing you can reliably know is that they didn't like it, right? Generally, if you're keeping, if the beans are cracking and they don't stop cracking until you dump the coffee out, you're probably not baking, even if your thermocouple shows it's going down. Because once again, thermocouples can confuse us because they could be above the bean mass, and then you've got your actual bean temperature down here, and then you bring your air temps down, and it looks like your bean temp descends, but it's really just going down to meet where the actual beans are. So whenever there's an issue where I'm like, is my thermocouple telling me the truth or the beans telling me the truth? It's always going to be the beans are telling me the truth. If they're actively popping, there's no way I'm losing temperature. It's just a reading issue. So those are the subjective ones, and we'll just kind of leave them over there in their own category and say, you know, if you like your own coffee, then don't worry about it. If you don't like your coffee, then maybe you can take people's criticisms into perspective and say, wow, they said this was underdeveloped. Maybe I give it a longer development time and see how it tastes. Now, when it comes to the objective ones, there's two major ones that people run into, and then there's two other ones that they run into less frequently. So scorching is probably the most difficult, because scorching comes from too hot of metal coming in contact with the beans early in the roast. This could be too high of heat application, could be too high of a charge temperature, something, not enough airflow, something along those lines. And it'll show up at the beginning, and then by the end of the roast, you can't see it, but you can still taste it. It's kind of got this burnt aftertaste in the coffee. So everything else about the coffee tastes lovely and beautiful and amazing, but there's like a burnt aftertaste. When you detect that, that's when you start looking for tipping and scorching. Scorching, you'll see before browning typically, and it will be little black specks showing up on the outside of the seed. And this means that your metal is overly hot for some reason or another, and you're damaging the coffee. And this is objective. You see it or you don't. Right? Sometimes scorching doesn't show up in the taste if it's minor enough, but often it does. Tipping is nicer because tipping shows up at the finished roast product. And so if you look at your beans at the end of the roast, not the Quakers or the lighter roasted beans, which are due to sugar content differences or agricultural issues, but the normal coffee beans that are in your mix, if there's a black mark on one side where the embryo would have germinated, then you've potentially exposed the coffee to too much heat too quickly. And by roasting the coffee too quickly, you've charred the soft spot on the seed, which is where the embryo would have germinated. So that can create the same sort of roasted flavor as the scorching, where it's kind of this burnt aftertaste because there is just charred coffee bean material in your cup. In cases where they're really bad, you can actually see the charred bits floating at the end when you're cupping or when you're tasting it. So if you see charred bits floating and it's a light roast, something's off, right? Two less common ones are facing. So facing is like scorching, but it happens at the end of the roast. And it's usually from overloading your roasting chamber. So if you put too much coffee in there, or if your drum speed is too slow and the beans are getting stuck along the sides, the flat part usually will just char and burn. And that's easy to pick up on.
Is this the chipping, or is this something different? Because sometimes you see the...
That's facing that we're talking about now. Chipping is the other one, though. Chipping is where if you roast too dark, a little spot on the bean will blow out and it looks like a moon crater. And that's really due to, more than likely, due to the coffee going through glass transition in the roasting drum and there being a pocket of pressure that hasn't been relieved yet that causes it to blow off. So that usually only happens in dark roasting. And the old SCAA materials and SCA current materials suggest that there's no flavor defect with this, it's only visual. So if you've got the moon craters, it's only going to harm you if you're selling whole bean in like clear glass containers where people can see it. But otherwise, it's not a problem.
What the others are, and are they kind of, so baking comes from roasting too slow? Or what is
So these are all so the different definitions we can go into. So first you've got Scott Rayo's definition, which is where you have too sharp of a rate of rise coming down, right? You have the current SCA definition, which is that your development time is too long. And then you've got the old SCAA definition, which is that you actually go below caramelization temperature and then come back up and finish the roast. So you've got a loss of temperature post first crack. So those are the three primary definitions. There's other nuanced versions of this that come in all over the place. What I would say is this, with Scott's, I can agree that it probably produces a bready or baked flavor. If you're losing temperature too fast and the beans are actually losing temperature too fast. So if you have an insufficient roast color, you're going to have this problem. Or if your development time is too short, you're going to have this problem before you have to dump out because you go to 0 rate of rise. I personally love a style of roasting where I have a sharp decline after first crack myself, but I'm also able to do that while still getting 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes development time and ending in a proper color. So the danger is, and I think what he's trying to convince people to be careful about is really like, if it's dropping fast, it's probably not as good as if it's not dropping fast for most people. Morton's definition, I think, is which ended up being the current SCA definition, which is a prolonged development time. I think that that's true too. If you have a very, very long development time to a light roast color, you will end up with a baked coffee. Everything's cooked out of it. I think this is also already covered in the definition of overdeveloped. And so for me, instead of baked, I would just say it's overdeveloped. The old SCA definition is my personal favorite because it's something separate and unique to itself. And most people don't struggle with this now because our thermocouples are thinner. But when we had thicker thermocouples in production roasting, this was a huge issue that you have happen and not know why it happened. Because the thermocouples had their own thermal mass. And so sometimes you wouldn't see, I turned down a little too sharply there at the end of the roast, because a lot of people would just roast, hit first crack and turn the heat off and have enough energy left in the drum to carry it on through to the proper end development time. But we also had like 6 millimeter thermocouples, right? You didn't even hit turning point until 2.5 minutes. So what I think was really happening was that for a lot of people, they would turn down the burner and the coffee would tank and then it would slowly start to climb back up. Because you've got this, suddenly your air temp's gone, right? And that would cause baking. And to me, the way that the baking flavor always tastes is like there's a subtle hint of like corn chips in the background, where it's sweet, but something's not quite right about it. And that's how I would understand baking personally. And so if you are losing temperature and losing heat in your system and then going on to finish the roast, the chemical reactions, when they kind of stop or are stopped, can't really just pick back up and start off where they left off. They change. So
And about the other two, is it because you've been talking about scorching and tipping, and when you talked about scorching, you talked about to heat metal, so this sounds a bit like a conduction, like it's coming from conduction. Is there kind of a relation between the the method of heat transfer and the risk of having different roasting defects? Or because there are also a lot of people that are saying, for example, conductive energy brings more this Italian style roast, and convection brings a bit more this third wave roasting. Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I think that so first of all, even old Probat roasters, which are regarded as being very conductive, are 70% convection. So all coffee roasting machines, all modern coffee roasting machines rely very heavily on convective heat energy transfer. The reason for this is just hot air transfers energy to the beans faster. And this is also in part why, as you turn your drum speed up, the coffee just roasts more quickly. And so, if you have a roaster and you have some junk beans laying around, give it a try. Roast full power to second crack, and then do it again with a faster drum speed and see which one gets the second crack faster. And it's kind of shocking. Even on the bullet, it's a bit different. On the Alio bullet, a faster drum speed still works out, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I have an air temperature monitor in mine, and my air temperature is above my bean temperature for the majority of the roast, but not for the entire roast. So not really sure exactly how that fits in with our discussion.
Talking about really an air temperature probe, not the IBTS. So you placed,
yes.
And where did you place it? In the exhaust, in the little exhaust below the
Yeah, so I put a little hole in the rubber stopper and stuck my thermocouple in there.
Okay.
So that I didn't have to modify the actual machine by cutting into it. And then there's just a moment where I pull it out and put it back in and everything, but everything's fine otherwise. So yeah, I don't know regarding the bullet exactly how that works out, but for all other roasting machines, any production machine you've ever been on, like traditional drum roasters, Lorings, doesn't matter. They're all primarily convective. Probats, Giesens, Diedrichs, all of them. And so, conduction is what's causing scorching, full stop. So if you're having scorching, you have too much conductive heat energy in the system. If you're relying on conductive heat energy transfer, you're going to have slower roasting. And that might be what they're attributing the Italian style of roasting to. Slower, darker, right? A little bit more char on the outside, no problem. You could achieve the same thing with a fully convective roaster. And in fact, I help people transition all the time to Lorings from traditional roasters. You can go pretty dark on a convective machine, absolutely no problem. So I don't know that it's that per se, but I think it forces you to default into a certain style. Convection can cause tipping because only with convective heat energy transfer can you actually roast the coffee fast enough to get it. So, scorching on conductive side, tipping on convective side. Generally, I would favor convection over conduction. I think both are good, but I think the bean doesn't really care who it's getting the energy from or what it's getting the energy from. The bean just receives the energy and then does chemical reactions with it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting discussion or finding also, because that's a question that's driving a lot of people, what machine to buy, and shall I buy a machine with more convective heat transfer or more conductive heat transfer, or what system? And I know you did with Ann Cooper a research on that. So can you give kind of one or two findings on, what do people do care about when they want to choose a roasting machine? I mean, first of all, when it comes probably to taste that you can create with the machine, but also maybe there are also other factors that you should have a look at when buying a coffee roasting machine.
Yeah, so, flavor-wise, especially if you're light roasting, I think you can buy pretty much any machine that's well built. I will say that the cost usually indicates the build quality, right? And so if you pay less money, you're probably going to get a lower quality build on your machine. So, sometimes people shy away from wanting to buy really well built, nicer machines because they're more expensive, and that's okay. Like if that's your budget, but in life, generally you get what you pay for. So I feel pretty confident that you put me in front of a roaster, even a poorly built one, I can figure out a way to make really nice tasting coffee on it. I don't think that that's ever going to be an issue. There is a big difference between fluidized bed and drum roasting. And the Loring is the drum roaster. I'll just kind of say that first and foremost. It is a drum roaster. It uses drum to agitate. If you compare the Loring, even the S70, which is the biggest machine, which has the most airflow at full power, to an Ikawa, the Ikawa has 6 times more air movement per gram of coffee than the Loring. So it's a matter of like huge differences. And the Loring S70 at full power is the fastest airspeed drum roaster that I'm aware of. And so when you make the jump from fluidized bed or drum to fluidized bed, it's a totally different world. So that's been one of the areas where I've gotten close to getting something I'm happy with matching to a drum roaster on the Ikawa, but I haven't perfectly done it yet. So that's kind of where that breaks apart for me. So if you're looking at fluidized bed versus drum, that is a big difference in terms of choosing your preference and flavor preference. Usually on fluidized bed roasters, there tends to be a little bit more of a chocolate note in your light roast coffees than on drum roasters, where there tends to be a little less, having to do just with the volume of hot airflow you're moving across the bean toward the end of the roast. Usually your whole bean and ground color differential is a little bit bigger. So for the right ground color, your whole bean's just a touch darker, so you get this little bit of a chocolate note. But it's not distracting. It's not a problem. You can still have delicious coffee. Now, that being said, across drum roasters, I mean, you pay your money, you make your choice, and you find the one that's right for you. You know, if you're buying new, ask people in your area who they have and how happy they are with their customer service. There's a lot of customer service issues in coffee roasters worldwide. And if you just paid like $50,000, $60,000 for a new roaster, and then the company that you bought it from ghosts you, that's not okay. So ask around, make sure they have good customer service in your area, make sure their reps do a good job checking in. You know, environmental concerns, I would definitely take those into account. Quality of the coffee, you're probably going to be able to make things good on any machine. Now, if you have a faster style of roasting, you may want to take that into consideration and find a roaster that's powerful enough to do capacity with your style. Because a lot of roasters are designed, you know, there's this hard thing where our industry moves so fast and we expect the engineering teams to keep up, and that just doesn't happen. Because like, you know, 10, 15 years ago, a 15-minute roast was specialty coffee. You know, a 17-minute roast was totally fine. That was normal. And so the machine manufacturers are building for that. And then it got shorter. The machine manufacturers had to go back, redesign, rebuild, test, and then produce. And then it changes again and again and again. And now the standard is like, most people are roasting closer to 9 minutes total time. Like they're roasting quite fast. And the machine manufacturers haven't caught up with that yet because they haven't had the time since people have made this shift. So if you have a faster style of roasting, look for a machine that fits your style of roasting at a full capacity. So, because otherwise you're buying a roaster and you're only using 50% of your batch size. So that would be kind of what I would look to more. Which ones have the power to meet what you're doing?
Okay, interesting. So then if you want to roast a bit faster and your machine isn't capable of really like roasting the whole batch that fast, you will probably need to have a bit larger machine in order then to not use the full capacity, but go to maybe like 60, 80%, something like that.
Or even just looking around. So like, for example, just with the S7 that's sitting next to me, the Loring S7, they learned it compared to the S15, S35. So the S15, S35, S70, I could do a full batch in maybe 10 to 11 minutes max, at fastest. On the S7, I can do a full 7 kilo in like 8.5 minutes.
Okay.
It's just way overpowered. And so even within the Loring product line, if I'm doing super fast roasting, and I don't need a lot of capacity, I would choose the 7 just because I can do a full 7 kilo, rock it out, no problem. Whereas if I was looking at, if I was a slower roaster, I could pick any of them. You know, and same thing, like if you're roasting at 9 minutes first crack, that's kind of more of a worldwide standard. You can probably do 80% capacity on almost any roaster and hit first crack at 9 minutes, but you should still test it first. You know, go test a roaster, see if you can hit crack anywhere near the time frame that you want to. And if you can't, I'm sure that there's a roaster manufacturer out there that makes one you can. And you know, unless you're going terribly fast, and then consider buying a bigger roaster than you need.
Interesting. And then, I mean, when you go to your roaster, one question about profile roasting, because I think it's sometimes hard then to go on your production roaster and then like try out and work on profiles, and you're a bit limited probably with how far you can go with the amount. So does it make sense to have kind of a smaller machine, do profiles on that, and then translate it to the larger production roaster, or is it really too difficult to translate those profiles?
Translation's nice. So you just take the same thing we talked about in terms of level of importance, and you match it to a bigger machine. So when I'm doing testing small scale, whether I'm using my Alio Bullet or doing something small in my 3 kilo that I want to transfer to the 7, color is the most important. You hit your correct colors, you're going to be most of the way there. Development time next, hit the right development time, and then hit first crack on time, and you're in really good shape. You know, in terms of transitioning a profile from a smaller roaster to a larger one. So if you've done a development roast on your Alio and you're really happy with it and you're ready to move it to production, you know, after you've taken color measurements on both for a while, you'll know kind of like, oh, I ended around this color. I know what I need to push it to in terms of in temp on my bigger machine. Your weight loss should be consistent across the roasters. Your development time should be consistent. When you hit first crack should be consistent, and your color should be consistent. You match those up and you're good to go.
Yeah. Okay. Because a lot of people are, kind of looking for roast curves, and then they would like to take the roast curve that I find on the internet or in a coffee board or something like that, and then follow this curve on their machine. But this is probably something that's difficult. So you really have to look at these factors like color, development time to first crack. So these are kind of the measures, and all the in-betweens are a bit difficult to translate from machine to the other. Is this?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So we've been talking about translating profiles from one roaster to the other, but how is it within one roaster? For example, I have a question from an ILO Bullet user who is working with 300-gram samples, with 300-gram batches, and now he wants to do 1 kilo batches, for example. So how can you translate within a roasting machine the batch from a smaller to a larger capacity?
Same way. Now, the IBTS theoretically should tell you pretty close. I think that there's still a little wiggle in that. I don't think it's like 300 grams up to full kilo, no problem, in terms of temperature reading, but I would suggest you do the same way. So you start with color and you try and get the color to match. And if you don't have a color reader, you could even just keep a sample, whole bean and ground, and then put the other one on top of it and see how close it is. And then you know how to adjust. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll be better than nothing. So you would want your weight loss to be the same as your 300-gram batch. Your color should be the same. You should hit first crack at the same time, have the same development time. So you scale up exactly. There is, the thought process overall in roasters that when you're going from a small batch to a bigger batch, you have to go longer. And that's not necessarily the case. You don't have to go longer. You just have to change your power settings and your charge temperature. So going 300 grams up to the higher one, not knowing how fast they're roasting, I'm already saying, like, let's push to 275 for a charge temperature, probably hit it with P9 straight out, D9, maybe F2, just to have some airflow moving, but keep it really low to try and keep heat in the chamber, and just push really hard, and then, start slowing down as needed to get to yellowing on time and to first crack on time.
Okay.
Pretty unromantic. There's no real trick to it.
Yeah. So kind of have the same time, but then just apply more heat in order to, have about the same roast with a larger capacity. What's your opinion on the IBTS? Is it like, do you see, could this be the future, or is it more like a toy or an additional feature, but you still want to more rely on the BT probe?
I'm a very skeptical person most of the time. I think I feel like I'm skeptical, but I'm skeptically optimistic about IBTS. One of the things that I want to do to just kind of really understand it is I want to see it put on other roasting machines too. And so one of the things I've been talking to him about is I'm like, I would love to be able to throw this on my US roaster core and just see how it compares to the data that I'm used to seeing. And really be able to test it as a system. I find that it seems really reliable. I'm still skeptical, but I'm optimistically skeptical about it.
Hey, thanks a lot, Rob, for sharing all those tips and tricks and hacks and information. And in general, thank you for all the work you're doing for the coffee roasting community. I really appreciate that. And thank you also for taking your time. Can you maybe say if people want to know more about you and what you offer and where they can find out more about you?
Yeah. So if you want to know more about me, go to host.coffee. That's the actual website, host.coffee, HOOS.COFFEE. I also have a side project I'm working on, which is Iteration Coffee. So ITERATION.coffee. And I've got a really exciting thing going on there. So this month's release is a coffee from the Galapagos.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah.
Never heard that there is coffee growing on the Galapagos.
Oh, the pictures that they sent me are crazy. There's like giant tortoises walking around eating coffee cherries off the tree. Yeah. So.
Wow. And do you send the coffee to Europe as well?
I do. Yeah. Shipping, unfortunately, really sucks right now, international. Yeah. I'm trying to keep it as cheap as I can. So I'm using DHL, which is the cheapest option out there. So, yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for taking your time and all the information you shared. And yeah, hope to see you soon.
Sounds
Bye-bye.
great. Take care.
Thanks.